Good evening, everyone. I'd like to get started. My name is Amy. I will be moderating the session this evening, and I'm very happy to introduce tonight's speaker, Sherilyn MacGregor. Sherilyn joined the University of Manchester in 2015 as a reader, but was promoted last year to full lecturer in the Environmental Politics Group in the Department of Politics and Sustainable Consumption Institute. She's one of a small number of scholars in the UK specializing in the interdisciplinary field of gender and environmental politics. Her research explores themes of environmental sustainability, gender equality, as well as theories and practices of citizenship. She's worked in universities around the world, including Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, and France, in several transdisciplinary fields, including gender studies, urban planning, and environmental studies. To give you a bit more of a taste of the research in which she's involved, in 2017 she published the Handbook of Gender and the Environment, which presents a state-of-the-art reflection from leading researchers and practitioners on the gender dimensions of a wide variety of modern challenges, including sustainable development and climate change politics, but also queer ecology and interspecies ethics. So these are very big, new, important questions to be asking in this day and age. I'm really looking forward to Sherilyn's talk tonight, where she'll speak about the rise of the ecofeminist movement, tracing its history, this idea of the caring city, so a kind of core concept of the feminist movement, but then also talking about the ideas and the importance of behind the feminist New Deal. Of course, after the talk, we'll have time for a fruitful discussion, so please keep your questions in mind as she's giving her talk. And yeah, without further ado, please, Sherilyn.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for the invitation, and thank you to Lena, who I don't think is here, for all of her work to organize my travel, and it was not easy. Yeah, and actually, I should just start by saying that I'm actually on strike today. My union in the UK, the 𝗺cie is on strike, and I've been on strike for the last several days, and anyway, but I'm here, so not representing the University of Manchester, I'm representing myself and offering some insights into some of the research that I've done, going back a long time. So I'm going to talk about why the time is right for eco-feminist urban visions, and I'd like you to maybe join me in questioning, thinking about this claim. Is the time right? It's a bold claim. I would like to suggest that it is, that the time is right, but I also don't want to avoid the fact that feminists and ecofeminists have been making the same kinds of demands and same types of interventions in urban studies and urban planning for decades. We've said it all before. And there's also a lot of barriers, and the same kinds of barriers to implementing some of these visions exist and maybe are even getting worse. So I'm going to give you a kind of glimpse into an approach, an imaginary, but I'm not going to engage in wishful thinking. And I hope we can have a conversation afterwards about some of the challenges and maybe end on some hopeful notes as well. So here's an overview of what I'm going to talk about in the next 45 minutes to an hour. I'm going to sort of set the scene, talk about the times we're in, the time of polycrisis. I'm going to give you an intro to ecofeminisms, just very briefly, a bit more on why care and why do we talk about care in the city, a bit of a brief history of feminist and ecofeminist urbanism, leading into some key principles of what a feminist caring city approach entails. Then I want to talk about a few examples from recent research that I've been doing, confronting the obvious, which is the backlash and the protest against some of these visions, and then finally have a discussion. And I'm really looking forward to hearing your own experiences, your research, your comments. It doesn't have to be just asking me more questions. So please think about how you might intervene in the conversation. I tried to do something really clever, which probably is half as clever as I hoped, but it still was a good intention. You can scan the QR code, and it will take you to a Google Doc, which has many of the references to literature that I'll mention. and some that I would recommend looking at. However, you'll have to send me a request to let you access it. So that was the part that I wasn't planning for, that I'll have to give you permission. But anyway, take note. You can go online and have a look at this sort of emerging bibliography. I'll let it be open to people adding things. So if you want to add your own recommended readings for feminist and ecofeminist urbanism, then you're welcome to do that. Okay, I want to start in 1995. And I hope this doesn't seem too indulgent, but when I was starting to prepare for this talk, Lena told me a lot of people who will be attending, watching at home are master's students studying urban issues, urban planning, architecture, etc. And so I thought, okay, think about what, back into my own days of being a master's student. And I came to planning as a kind of, it was in fact a change of plans. So I'm going to just give you a little story of my own kind of journey. I hate that term, but the sort of journey into what I'm talking about today. I did an undergraduate degree in gender studies in the late 80s. I always thought after I did that I was going to become a lawyer and defend and fight for women's rights. And that was always going to be my plan. For some reason, I took a different direction and decided to study urban planning instead. I decided through thinking about what at the time was a sort of women's urban safety movement, that more possibly could be done to change gender relations, to change society for the better for women by changing the urban environment, and by thinking about how do we make spaces more friendly and safe for not just women, but for all people who don't fit the kind of dominant model that cities are planned for. So I decided to do a planning degree. While I did a planning degree, I did a case study for my master's thesis on a feminist urban planning activist organization in Toronto. It was called Women Plan Toronto. And their mission was to teach women about urban planning and urban planners about women. And they had a long history of activism in the city. I wrote about them. I learned so much from them. And through my various networks, I got involved in writing this book called Change of Plans Towards a Non-Sexist and Sustainable City. And so this is a long time ago, right? 95. Some of you probably weren't even born then. So I hadn't thought about it for a long time, but when I thought about it, I'm going to talk about care in the city and an ecofeminist urban vision, I realized that I had this vision, and several of us had this vision almost 30 years ago, right? And I went back to look at the book, and I actually wrote the introduction and the introductory chapter and the conclusion chapter, and I just wanted to give you a little flavor of what I was writing. This is as a master's student. I had just finished my master's. The first, and it's actually quite sweet, and I'm a bit sort of embarrassed, but I said at the time that we are still arguing for cities as if women counted. In 1995 may mean that the planning profession is as resistant to change as every other institution in patriarchal society. But for me, this persistence is cause for celebration because it means that feminist urban visions are strong, innovative, and gaining validity at a time when our communities need them most. And I think, yeah, I was feeling very optimistic, but we're still talking about it in 95, right? I mean, think at the time, I was so impatient. Little did I know I'd be, anyway. So then, and the final one, this also sort of like, encapsulates the whole book, which is an edited collection of different chapters on different aspects of gender and urban planning, but the creation of an infrastructure that strengthens intra-community connections, preserves the ecosystem, and fosters social equity is the key to achieving sustainable cities. If we are to realize this goal for the sake of future generations as well as our own, then we require a radical change of plans. So I thought that was really interesting to start because, and I'm saying in this talk, the time is right. but we thought the time was right 30 years ago as well. So it means that there's still a lot of work to be done. There's still a reason to be talking about this. And the other thing is that a lot of the ideas and the concepts that I'm going to present tonight, that I'm calling ecofeminist urban visions, are not new. But the time has possibly changed. We are in potentially a different moment in Earth's history, in our global society's history. We are in an emergency. And of course, most of you here don't need me to spend much time explaining the emergency or why we stopped talking about climate change and started talking about emergency breakdown and so forth, right? I think I probably will skip my notes that tell you about, you know, the last 4 years were the hottest on record, sea level rise, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, you've heard it all before, and I don't need to bring it up here. But I think that, you know, thinking about the emergency, thinking about the climate emergency and the way that people who are trying to do something about it, thinking about cities is kind of an important point to make, that we are at a time when cities have become a kind of key battleground or a key place of action for addressing the climate emergency. In light of the lack of progress by national governments that we see each year at the COPs, the lack of progress, you know, cities are the place where perhaps more can happen. And there are more examples of success at the city level than there are at many other levels. And we also know that it's an urgent challenge to address the impacts of the climate emergency on people living in cities. The effects of climate emergency on city dwellers are massive, and of course climate change hurts the most vulnerable and the poorest and the most powerful and the least powerful the most. From an ecofeminist perspective, we don't want to just focus on the climate emergency, however, or the climate crisis. It's important to understand climate as part of what some have called a polycrisis, where disparate crises interact such that the overall impact far exceeds the sum of each part. So we, of course, at the same time as understanding the extreme challenges of the climate emergency, it's also important to look at the same time at the care crisis, that there's a crisis of care intensifying in all countries, rich and poor, north and south. And what does this mean? Well, certainly in feminist literature on the care crisis, it's not just about the crisis of health care, which everyone will be aware of. And of course, the pandemic has made us realize that our healthcare systems are often not fit for purpose. They don't respond quickly enough. But more generally, it means that more and more people are unable to live material, secure, and healthy lives with emotional well-being and fulfilled relationships in clean and flourishing environments. The level of help and support for people to achieve such lives, which we could say is a fundamental human right, has been declining over the past several decades. And a crisis of care also means that those who provide care to others in the form of day-to-day care work and emotional support are unable to do so satisfactorily and under dignified conditions. And there's a massive gap between care needs and the resources available to meet these needs. And the effects of the care crisis are serious, and they're being intensified and exacerbated by other crises like the climate crisis, like the COVID-19 crisis, and like the cost of living crisis, right? And people are probably in this room around Brussels and around Europe and certainly in the UK, we're talking a lot about the cost of living crisis, which is making everything more difficult to cope with and to survive. We could also add some other crises, global refugee crisis, the global crisis of the trend of rising right-wing populism and fascism around the world. So the point, so why am I starting with quite a depressing moment of talking about polycrisis? The point of starting with this rather grim account is not to depress you, But of course, it is deeply worrying. But really, for the purposes of my talk, I want to kind of put this backdrop to thinking about why the time may be right for looking at some of these more radical and perhaps less understood approaches. And ecofeminism, which I'm going to talk to you about next, is one of these perspectives that I think has a lot of qualities and ideas that are becoming more and more relevant. So let's talk about ecofeminisms. And of course, I use the term in a plural sense because it's a plural movement, and I don't want to say that my definition is the only definition. It's the one I'm giving you. You could read other authors or scholars who would possibly give a different account. But so as far as I'm going to define it, ecofeminism has been around since probably around the 1970s. It's a kind of bringing together of two of the most significant new social movements of the 20th century, the environmental movement and the feminist movement. Today, it is a diverse global political movement that sees the oppression of women plus and nature as interlinked. It brings rejection of anthropocentrism into feminism and resistance to misogyny plus into environmentalism. So it basically argues that feminism without environmentalism is very flawed. Environmentalism without feminism is very flawed. The pluses in that quote is to signal the intersectionality that is so fundamental to ecofeminism as well, that we're not only talking about women, we're also talking about people of other genders, LGBTQI+, we're talking about racialized people, we're talking about indigenous peoples, various social groups that have been often presented as inferior or often feminized, and that these oppressions are interlinked. It focuses on interdependence and eco-dependence, right? As a fundamental belief is that there is no such thing as being an independent human being. All human beings are dependent on each other to survive and dependent on the earth to survive, right? So interdependent and dependent from birth to death, and eco-dependent, we depend on the earth in order to survive. Therefore, it asserts the value of social reproduction. So we depend on the care, the nurturing, the attention, emotional and physical support of other people to allow our societies to reproduce, to continue into the future. It calls for recommoning of what has been privatized and for democratizing care. So comes a long history of the analysis, which I don't have time to get into, but thinking about how so much of our problems today have been about taking what was common and putting them into private hands, enclosing the commons. At the beginning of capitalism, right? We couldn't have capitalism if we didn't privatize and enclose the commons. And that, for many feminist historians and eco-feminist historians, we'll see as some of the beginnings of our demise. And for a democratizing of care, that it shouldn't be left to particular people, that it should be a responsibility, that in fact care is a common good and should be treated as a common good. I often like to think of the 5 I's of ecofeminism. So if you want to remember the 5 I's, I've already said intersectionality, interdependence. The third one would be integration, so integrating the principles and the ideas of feminism and environmentalism, that you can't solve one problem of gender equality without thinking about the environment. You can't solve the problem of the ecological crisis without thinking about gender. The other 2 I's are, we do this through interdisciplinary thinking, research, and it tries to be as international as possible. So intersectionality, interdependence, integration, interdisciplinarity, and international. As I said, it's been around since about the 70s. Often the people will say that the term ecofeminism was coined by Françoise Daubonne in a book from the 70s called Feminism or Death. which is a fairly obscure book, but it has been recently reissued and translated into English. Probably not as significant in this audience, but for me it was very significant that it was finally translated after 50 years into English so that more people could read it. And it's very interesting that it has been reconnected with or rediscovered with a new generation of feminist, or sort of eco-feminist activists who are reclaiming the term. For many years, you couldn't use the term. It was quite dismissed, quite a bad word. Many people wouldn't use it. I mean, I didn't use it for many years to describe my work or my own sort of beliefs. And in fact, sort of, I look back at the Change of Plans book, and when I mentioned ecofeminism, it was in quotes, sort of like, oh, some would call this ecofeminist, because it just wasn't very acceptable. But now it's being rediscovered. And in the intro to the translation of 𝗺's book, these two activists who write the introduction are saying that, you know, ecofeminism is about the importance of learning from and critically engaging with the earlier generation of ecofeminist scholars, and what they're calling for and how they reinterpret it is that it's a radical, intersectional, and decolonial ecofeminism that is extremely nuanced and non-monolithic, rather than centering elite women. It centers �LGBT_2S+, indigenous, global southern, and decolonial feminist voices, and it is the polar opposite of white liberal feminism. And so to illustrate this, I'm sort of using this tweet from 𝗳cie𝗃𝗶𝗴, who is a Nigerian eco-feminist activist, and she calls herself the ecofeminist. And I had a conversation with her about a year or so ago, and I asked her, so why do you call yourself the ecofeminist? And she sort of answered my question in a way that's almost like she made up the term. It's like she actually hadn't heard about the kind of the literature. She didn't know any negative connotations of it. She just saw it, embraced it as this really exciting, obvious kind of term. And so she's done tons of interviews about it. And there's this article in Global Citizen from last year by an American activist named Leah Rodriguez, and it's a whole sort of article talking about all of these young activists, mostly from the global south, mostly young women of color, who are getting behind this term, rekindling the term, and the definition is sort of their own take on it, which isn't far from the original, but it's feminist. Ecofeminism suggests that patriarchy is the driving source behind degradation of the planet and exploitation of women, issues that are inextricably linked and cannot be resolved without dismantling oppressive masculine power systems. So they're making the connections, and they're bringing it back into the public domain. And this is really important to look at, and to look at the use of these types of arguments and this types of discourse by people involved in activism, because we really do have to, sort of in my view, we do have to look to the role of social and political movements in this time of polycrisis. I heard someone recently say that the transition is inevitable, but a just transition is not. And the only way that we're going to ensure that there will be a just transition out of the fossil capitalist society is if as many people participate and articulate their demands, their needs, their concerns as possible. So transition is one way of thinking about it, but transformation is the word that most ecofeminists would use instead. And we don't just want to transition out of fossil fuels, we want a whole-scale transformation of society. And the way that is going to happen from an ecofeminist perspective is to put care at the center. So now I come to discussing care. Why care? What do we mean by care? Within feminist and ecofeminist circles, care is a series of concrete practices and activities, as well as a set of values. It's not just an ethic, it's also work. In the words of feminist philosopher Joan Tronto, Care includes everything we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. That world includes our bodies and our environment, which are interwoven in a complex, life-sustaining web. So care is about social reproduction and life-sustaining work. It's about caring for other people, caring for animals, plants, ecosystems. It's not just care, it's caring. So all that involves cooking, cleaning, taking care of, buying clothes, teaching people how to brush their teeth, all of those sorts of things that we have to do to socialize the next generation. And so that's thinking forward, social reproduction, but it's also about repairing the damage done to life by capitalism and other crises. So not just about reproducing forward, but fixing the harm, correcting and repairing the harms of the past, remediating damaged environments, repairing what has been lost. It's also, as I said, an ethical and political principle. It's not just about work, as I said, it's a particular approach to ethics and values, caring for the values of freedom, equality, and justice, and this is again from Joan Tronto. It's about emotional and relational well-being, and how healthy relationships in society are fostered and sustained. It should be central to politics, according to many feminists. It should be matter for democracies about how care is undertaken and by whom in society. Why is this important? Oh, I should say, I'm just referring here, and if people want to have a look at a sort of a sustained literature review on thinking about care and care work in the context of this polycrisis of the climate crisis, there's a report that I co-authored very recently for Oxfam called Caring in a Changing Climate. And in there we talk about ways of defining care, ways of understanding how it's being impacted by climate change, but also it includes a lot of the statistics that help to show that it still is very much an issue of gender and gender equality, because despite all of the changes that we've seen and the progress that's been made thanks to the feminist movement, women around the world still do the vast majority of caring labor on a daily basis, both paid and unpaid. So I've said that it's about transformation, and why this matters is that the way that care is divided in society is very uneven, and most feminist political economists would say that the fact that women do the majority of unpaid and low-paid care work is the main reason we have not been able to achieve gender equality. So transforming caring as usual is essential for achieving gender justice. So when you say we don't want business as usual, we also don't want caring as usual. And this is something that, again, in the report that I'm referring to now, we try to talk about how do you transform caring as usual into something else that addresses the problem of gender inequality. And here I talked about the 5 I's, now I'm going to talk about the 5 R's. Okay, so this is a very nice way to remember some of the key points about what are we trying to achieve when we talk about transforming care. And these are the 5 R's that come. These are used by the International Labour Organization. They're used by Oxfam. They're used by feminist political economists such as Diane Elson, who I think sort of started this discussion with the 3 R's, but it's been expanded over the years to be 5. So these are just in terms of thinking about policy, thinking about planning. What are sort of the things that need to be done to try to transform care to become more gender equal? So recognize its value. I've already said we need to recognize it as foundational to the economy. We wouldn't be here, the economy, the capitalism wouldn't be here without care. But, so recognizing the value, but what we need to do to transform caring as usual is to reduce the amount of it. And this is not to say that people don't get care. It's mean we do it more efficiently by finding ways of collectivizing. So if we have ways of collectivizing care, the individuals have to do less of it in their own everyday lives. So if you could think about finding economies of scale through a grocery delivery service or a co-op that allows you to go and get your washing done or your plants fertile. No, sorry, I'm losing my my examples there. But sort of trying to find a way of collectivizing would reduce the amount that individuals have to do, right? Redistribute by finding ways to, again, make sure more than just sort of unpaid women or underpaid women are doing it, make sure that we can find ways that it's redistributed socially so that more people have time to care and are able to do. So there's various ways of creating changes to work time, sort of the 4-day work week, for example. People would say that if you provide people with more time, they might be able to share care more equally. And finally, represent, so include carers in democratic debate so that we can understand what it is that policies need to do to address their concerns, and also the question of reward. So this is the long-standing debate about how do we reward caring, unpaid care, should it stay unpaid or should there be some way of remunerating that work? That's a long-standing debate among feminists, and I'm not going to necessarily get into it here. But so some of these will become, you'll see why I'm talking about these, they'll become a bit more relevant as we go along about, so how do we think about, how can we think about changing the structures of our living spaces, cities or households, to embed some of these principles. The question, though, that what I want to ask from a feminist ecofeminist perspective is, so we've got all of these 5 Rs, and most of these 5 Rs are considered as a way to transform care to improve gender justice. They don't necessarily ask questions about ecological justice or sustainability. So I would want to ask, and this could be something for even discussion later, is what are the implications for cities, for housing design and provision, for transport, other urban services, for public spaces and city politics, of trying to transform caring as usual? And what are the implications for resource use and waste and for carbon emissions? So this is what an ecofeminist lens would bring to this discussion of trying to transform care. That brings me now to a kind of a timeline, and I'm not sure how I'm doing for time. Timeline. Okay. Timeline of sort of ecofeminist urbanism. And again, I could probably give another whole lecture just on this, but I won't. But going back, and it was really interesting to me to kind of remind myself of the sort of going back. So I went back even further than the 90s to try and give you a sort of sense of where did this come from. And I remember studying as a master's student, as a planning student, being absolutely, my mind was absolutely blown by the work of Dolores Hayden, who tells this story of radical visions of feminism from the late 19th century. This is a very kind of global North history. It's not at all a global history. It's a very particular history of sort of North American and British feminist and socialist activism. But Dolores Hayden's history of that particular type of activism goes back to the 19th century of communitarian socialism, where men and women involved in communitarian socialism were really concerned about the separation of production and reproduction through the factory system, through the ways that early capitalism needed to separate what you did in the workplace and what was done at home, and saw that spatial separation as a very fundamental moment in the sort of beginnings of gender inequality. So they talked a lot about how to bring them back together, thinking about sort of these sort of communal types of living arrangements. These are people like Robert Owen, Charles Fourier in the late 19th century, how you could bring people together to live and work in the same place, have childcare on site, kitchenless houses. People worked together to have a collective existence that was very egalitarian. And that was very inspiring to a lot of feminists who got into the built environment professions. Hayden's history also talks about the progressive era and municipal housekeeping of the early 20th century, particularly in the US. where feminists became active in trying to provide services in urban areas. So thinking about how does one, provide for a family if you don't have running water and you don't have places to go to get help with your health or sick child. So the provision of the types of services that were provided for free at home brought into the municipal domain. So municipal housekeeping is what it was called. So it was a movement for that in the early 20th century. And also thinking about how do people live in it was sort of like the embrace of apartment living. So living in people, I mean, obviously they were, workers all living in the same place might have been called tenements, and obviously the quality wasn't great, but the idea of living in the same community, in the same building was popular until the sort of 1930s and 40s, when it was like everyone should have a single home. The American dream was to have a single family home in the suburbs. And for Hayden and the story of cities, certainly the new cities of North America, the dream was in the suburb, which was these houses to be filled up with lots of consumer goods, lots, washers, dryers. Everyone has their own car, everyone has their own lawnmower, etc. So it was a design for consumption, but also a design for men go to work, women stay at home and clean these big houses in the suburbs, right? And transport patterns and roads and provision of schools and everything else, location of services, all kind of revolved around these assumptions. So the sort of gender order is built into the design of houses and cities, and that's very durable, and they stay the same to this day. So the study of this is very important to feminist urbanism, because it starts to think, this is not just about designing cities. This is politics, right? This is inequality that's in our environment that is constraining our lives and constraining how we might live differently. So fast forward to the 60s and 70s, at the beginnings of the feminism and ecology movements. Here you see an interesting kind of critique of sort of the green movement in the 70s, which was all about back to the land and let's live in the rural communities, and communities are great. And here was a kind of time when feminists said, hang on a minute, cities are actually possibly better for women. Despite all of these problems, they're probably better than going back to these rural idyls of the sort of ideas that perhaps some green men might have been promoting at the time, right? So there's now an embrace, a defense of the city that were coming out in the 1960s and 70s. And there's a really great quote from 𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗃 that I think is really good to remember too. 𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗃 was the founder of the German Green, one of the founders of the German Green Party, and sort of listening to all of these great ideas about decentralization and local communities and let's all move to live on communes, would say, we don't want a new green society where men build windmills and women sit around quietly baking bread and weaving rugs, right? Because they could see this kind of, the same kind of gender caring as usual was going to be built into these visions of a green society. So there was a real kind of defense of the anonymity of the city. Cities can provide more services. Cities could be more liberating and free for women, but we need another way of thinking about cities. So then you have the rise in the 80s and 90s of the gender and built environment. Sort of it goes into geography, it goes into the universities, it becomes an area of research, feminist planning, and engaging in some of the discussions around sustainable development and so forth in the 80s and 90s. And a really great collection came out in 1990 called New Space for Women, which edited by Gerda Weckerle, Rebecca Peterson, and David Morley. And there was a really interesting collection of essays about everything from the design of houses to urban safety, to transport systems, to even thinking about the planning profession and how planners are educated. Moving on to the 2000s, we then see the beginning of gender and urban climate politics, and an awareness, as I sort of alluded to earlier, that the city is where it's at for tackling both social inequality and the climate crisis. And so you see a rise of, there's a really good article to sort of summarize that whole movement by 𝗹𝗲𝘃𝗀𝗃𝗴, which is a gender and urban climate change policy tackling cross-cutting issues towards equitable, sustainable cities. So again, the cross-cutting issues, the poly-crisis, but finding ways to bring the insights of feminist theory and feminist understandings about care and the importance of social reproduction into policy debates around climate change. And finally, the 2020s, we could see the actual use of the term feminist cities, caring cities, and very recently have I found some that are actually using the term eco-feminist cities. And they're not, and actually I think you have one of these authors coming to speak to you in the series. I'm not sure 𝗷𝗲𝗃𝗶𝗴 is coming, but this is one of the only articles I could find sort of published with the actual term ecofeminist healthy cities as an approach in the title. And this is in a pretty mainstream journal, right? The Journal of Epidemiology and Community Health. Perhaps it's becoming more mainstream. And I looked to try to find for you any examples. I cannot find for you any examples of eco-feminist cities, right? This is still an imaginary, still a kind of a vision and an approach. But one of the places where you can find a very comprehensive articulation of what it involves is this work out of Barcelona called Ecofeminist Proposal for Reimagining the City. And a quote that sums up what they're talking about is, ecofeminisms are the embodiment of a transformative, practical, and theoretical outlook in a time of multidimensional crisis, one from which we can challenge the idea of the city and make it a more livable, caring, and resilient place. And I recommend you have a look at the report. Barcelona is definitely a hotbed of feminist urban planning, and now trying to go beyond a feminist approach to an eco-feminist approach, which recognizes that we can't just be looking at gender equality in isolation to the issues of the climate. If there's time, I don't know, what do you think? 15 minutes. Okay, so what I would like to do is, because this will give me a chance to stop talking for 4 minutes, I have also found for you, again, one of the only places where I found a real-life embracing of the concept of eco-feminist city, and this is from this is a news clip where this is from only 3 months ago. This is the CBC, which is the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, where this group of women, again, feminist urban activism, the 𝗁𝗂𝗵𝗃𝗴, which is you can translate it yourself. I don't have to translate it for you. So a group of feminist activists in Montreal were putting 15 eco-feminist recommendations to the city. And I'll just let you see how the activist explains it to the news presenter. Just, yeah.
We're going to be talking a lot about the environment and climate change over the next few weeks as the UN Biodiversity Conference begins next week in Montreal. And the 𝗁𝗂𝗵𝗃𝗴 says any ecological action plans need to include women. The group counsels the Plante administration on women's rights in Montreal. Maryns is a member. Thanks for being here today.
My pleasure.
When it comes to women and climate change, how do gender inequalities and climate change intersect here in this city?
What you have to know first is that any crisis will accentuate social inequalities. We've seen it with the pandemic. Well, it's the same thing with climate change. In Montreal, where we know that statistically women are more vulnerable than men, mostly because they are poorer, but also they are more often renters. So what's the effect of that with the climate is that they will be more tend to live in disadvantaged neighborhoods where they will live in a housing that are in poor condition, meaning that they will have more chance to suffer from heat waves and also extreme cold. due to the poorly insulated and ventilated homes. What we did is that we really superimposed maps of social deprivation and maps of heat spot, and we really found an almost perfect correspondence for 11 areas in Montreal. In those areas, many of the apartments don't have balconies or backyards, meaning that women will have to go outside of their homes in order to get some fresh air during the heat waves. Although in those neighborhoods, there's also a lack of green spaces, because we know that there is an inequality of distribution of parks in Montreal. So that means they have to go in other neighborhoods, but in those neighborhoods, there's also a lack of public transportation. So already you can see that depending on your economical situation, you have some issues in relation with your resilience to climate change.
So the council came up with a list of recommendations about those things that your research has pointed out regarding the impact of climate change on women. So can you tell us just a couple of the main points?
What you have to know is that most of the action that we have right now in order to adapt ourselves against climate change are based on individual action. We can think about, for example, recycling, doing lunch for kids with less plastic waste, eating less meat. All these are really good action, although they really fall on the shoulders of women, because we know that women at 80% do carry out most of the domestic and care tasks in the house. So that means all the solution that we have now really comes from, really accentuate the burden of women. What we think is that solution should start from urban planning and social projects. So in the 15 recommendation that we have 3 main objectives. The first one is a greater understanding of gendered climate issues and their impact on women, really for the people that works in the city, all right? The second objective is to include women in climate action, so to collect data that is gendered, that is local and intersectional. And finally, the third recommendation, it's a greater involvement of Montrealer women and the solution that they propose in the fight against climate change.
So you shared your research as well as the recommendations to the city. Is the city listening to your recommendations?
Absolutely. We saw that in the climate plan of Montreal for the next 10 years, gender was not part of the data that they had. And when we showed them our research, they really were open about it, and they really considered our recommendation. So we really have a great hope about the reception of our research.
That's encouraging news. Maryns, Sarah, Saunier, thank you so much for telling us about your research.
It was a pleasure.
And if you go online to look for the 15 recommendations in the report, you can, it's only in French. So I'll have to let you read it and tell me what it says, because I'm afraid my French is non-existent after 20 years of living in the UK. So that gives you a flavor of, someone trying to advocate for ecofeminist city ideas in real life. I'm going to give you a kind of summary of what I think are some key principles of what an ecofeminist caring city entails. I don't have a lot of time to go into all of them in detail. I think I've touched on many, and they should sort of seem to you fairly evident by now. So the top one would obviously bring care to the heart of daily life in the city, so creating the spaces, providing the services and the practices that enable care. Many of this will also entail reclaiming of the commons, again, from the kind of the critique of privatization, reclaiming commons, not just common land, but also common good, common services, again, around providing basic needs. Meeting basic needs within a 15-minute journey. So many of you will have heard of the 15-minute city, but a city of proximity has been a long-standing principle of feminist urbanism, again, to do with trying to understand the complex transport needs and daily life patterns of people who do have a lot of caring responsibilities. So it's not easy to get around a city if you've got a child in tow or if you have to do lots of errands and so forth. So this whole notion of trying to provide a range of basic needs, school, work, shopping, health care, elder care, green space within a 15-minute walk, cycle, or public transport journey. Again, in addition, no area should be off limits. So this would also, recognize the really important concern about safety that feminist urbanists have always had, but also bringing in questions about accessibility and inclusivity, and no one should be feeling excluded in the city. Other things, affordable housing is a basic right. How can you care for others if you don't have a roof over your head? So again, thinking about the absolute necessity to ensure that housing is provided as a basic right. Ecofeminists also want to think about protecting, regenerating, and caring for nature in the city. So this is not just about making sure that humans are cared for, but also to extend that to the natural environment. And we can't do any of it unless we redistribute wealth to end poverty. We need to redistribute wealth to pay for a lot of these services, obviously. And this will not be achieved unless there's a much greater participation and democratization of decision-making to make local governments serve their inhabitants and not private capital. Of course, these are very, these are ideas that are not unique to a feminist urbanist or ecofeminist urbanist position. They share with many other activists, like the municipalist movement, for example. You might want to tell me what's missing, right? What is missing from this list, or what shouldn't be here? We can talk about that as well. But the thing to really always keep in mind, that what makes it ecofeminist is it integrates the desire for low environmental impact with high quality and high quality of life. So it's not about putting more pockets in, like giving women equal pay so they have more money to spend, or making sure that all women have a right to a car. I mean, these possibly go against the sort of ideas of trying to have a degrowth approach, or to ensure that we have more to life than spending money and working in a paid job. That there's a society that supports different types of pursuits that are supporting of life rather than making it more difficult. So that's my sort of sense of the principles. What I want to do now, because I only have a few minutes left, is just take a little bit of a tour and to give you some examples. Now, I already said there's no examples of ecofeminist caring cities to give you, right? It's an imaginary, it's an approach, something to strive for, and its time perhaps has come. However, from working in the field and trying to do research, I can only give you a few moves in the direction, right, to illustrate what's possible. And these three examples that I'll cover have in different sort of modest ways, or some are less modest than others, but to try to sort of show but putting care at the center can also help. All of these examples have care at the center, as well as being joined up eco-social transformation. So they're integrating the ideas of eco-social and gender transformation. The first one I want to talk about is a feminist Green New Deal. I was involved, I was commissioned by the Women's Budget Group and the Women's Environmental Network in the UK to write a roadmap for a feminist Green New Deal, and this involved doing a comprehensive analysis of existing Green New Deals in the UK, looking at them through a gender and feminist lens to see what is missing, what kinds of priorities have been foregrounded and which ones have been left out. So a critique of existing Green New Deals, and then a development of a kind of planning, a policy and planning vision that could lead to what I think would be close to a kind of a feminist or an eco-feminist understanding of a green, a just transformation or just transition. And we incorporated spatial justice into a feminist Green New Deal for the UK. Spatial justice is very rarely mentioned in any of the existing Green New Deals. We tried to take inspiration from feminist city planning in other cities to try to develop a kind of set of recommendations in the Green New Deal. And I'll just tell you what it is that we say in this. So we argue that the privatization of care and other forms of social reproduction in individual households has not only been a driver of women's equality, it is also resource intensive and wasteful. It is a feature of capitalism that, in rich countries like the UK, facilitates overconsumption, profit-oriented economic growth, environmental degradation, and climate change. Green New Deal plans currently do not make this connection, focusing instead on how to make private homes more energy efficient and how to get individuals to engage in sustainable practices such as water and energy conservation and waste recycling. There is no consideration of how everyday life practices could be made more resource efficient or how living spaces could be designed to maximize eco-efficiency at the same time as reducing the time required to carry them out. For example, old houses might be retrofitted with better insulation, and new build housing might conform to passive house specifications, but the way living spaces are designed to lock in certain gendered patterns, practices, and roles are not considered to be in need of change. Public transport might adopt electric or hydrogen-powered vehicles, but fail to devise routes and schedules that serve people with variable work and care patterns requiring multiple trips. That's what I've just talked about. While the transition to a decarbonized economy offers great potential to rethink a vast range of normalized features of daily life, insights from feminist architects, town planners, transport planners have not found their way into Green New Deal plans. So we recommend, therefore, that we transform social and physical infrastructure to ensure social reproduction is equally shared and uses resources efficiently. And we give 4 ways to do that. Enable collectivization of unpaid care and domestic work through design in order to move away from caring as usual, as well as to reduce material throughput. Better designs will enable better service provision and mutual aid, thereby making care work less time-consuming. So this is about enabling collectivization. The second thing is designing new houses and flats with dedicated spaces for things like drying laundry, storing bulk goods and recyclables, providing communal gardens, kitchens, utility sheds, etc. Promote and fund co-housing developments, intentional communities, and community land trusts in urban and rural areas to include, in order to co-locate carers, people requiring care, and amenities in close proximity. And finally, ensure public transport schedules are co-designed with users. So these are the spatial justice dimensions that we added into the Green New Deal. And as far as I know, every time we've given talks about what a feminist Green New Deal would look like, the most positive reaction we get was around these urban planning recommendations, because few people have thought about them. The 2 final examples I'm going to give you is this is about co-housing, and this follows up. This is why we were so keen to add co-housing into the feminist Green New Deal, is that eco-co-housing and co-housing is something that I've been looking at for a long time, and recently wrote a paper working with 𝗵𝗵𝘃𝗶𝗃𝗀, who's a co-housing expert who studied co-housing throughout Europe, talked about its feasibility, its history, where it's being taken up in different places. And we argue that co-housing is something that really needs to be highlighted as a potential way of collectivizing care and reducing environmental impact, reducing carbon emissions. So we visited a number of projects in the UK and the Netherlands in 2017 and looked at the promise of these types of communities, but also wanted to, as we say, go beyond wishful thinking and recognize that still a lot has to be done. A lot of co-housing is very elite. It is only affordable by certain types of people, often And often the eco is more important than the co. That it's all about the green tech and the fancy, new ways of heating and powering and all of those sorts of things with solar panels, etc. Oh, I've got some pictures. Sorry, but less so about the kind of issues that we wanted to talk about, which is making spaces for sharing. Spaces for sharing that is what has been so attractive to feminists for a long time about co-housing, that you can build into the household, the collective household, ways of saving time and other scarce resources through having things on site like tool and toy libraries, community gardens, communal kitchens and laundries, and so forth. And visiting the projects gave us a lot of insight into how these can work, and how they can actually enable people to share both the kind of everyday work of looking after each other and their children and so forth, but also to become more democratic and to put care on the agenda of how they run their collectives. So talking about how are we going to distribute these tasks? How are we going to ensure that this is egalitarian? And we talk about in the paper that this can sort of start to build a culture of care, right? Through making it something that's not taken for granted, but something that has to be negotiated as a group all the time. So this is the ideal. They don't always work, and Ludovai's work is really really helpful in showing how and where they do work. Finally, a really example of where you can think about sharing space, sharing resources, and care is an example of the oldest co-housing project for older women in the UK, which is called 𝗬𝗲, the Older Women's Co-housing in London. And it's, again, a group of women who came together who decided they wanted to pool their resources and live together in a way that shares their own finances, but also and gives them a very comfortable and convivial life as they age together. So it's not just about creating these spaces to reduce the amount of work individuals have to do. While this is important and it can offer more sharing of these tasks so that it doesn't always fall to certain people, but it also, this notion of building community, and this is where I'm going to end, is my third example of research that I've been doing in Manchester for the past 5 or so years, which is to look at, it's a very small example of what I would see as part of bringing care into the city, bringing and making care part of everyday life in the city, making space for care in everyday life. And this is I've been following in Moss Side, this is a community or a neighborhood where I live in Manchester. And over the last sort of 10 years or so, there's been this movement to try to reclaim the back alleys in this terraced neighborhood. So this is sort of an Edwardian sort of turn of the 20th century kind of housing in quite poor repair. The alleys don't all look like this. I've given you only the nice pictures. This is after the communities have come together to reclaim the common space as their own and turn them into spaces for being together, for growing plants, to regenerate sort of green in a place where there's very little green unless people deliberately plant it, to bring pollinators and birds back into the city, and to work together with their neighbors, to get to know their neighbors, to talk across difference, people from all backgrounds and ethnicities, and feeling that they can, find some kind of way to connect across difference and build something in common. And you can see, I think these are really great images, very beautiful, colorful images to show that, that caring can happen in public spaces as well, and the benefits of it to community are potentially massive. And just to give you think about what I think is, again, part of this notion of bringing care into the city is not just about, as I said, resource use and time use and so forth, but rebuilding what has been lost through decades of austerity, through alienation that's happened through, I don't have to list you all the reasons why there's, people are quite alienated from each other. This is just a quote from one of the residents who talk about how important it is to have their alley greening project. And I guess, you know, what I've taken away from particularly the municipalist movement is saying that cities that can bring people together to find common ground is so important to fighting it, to addressing the fear of the other that is driving xenophobia and anti-immigrant sentiments and driving the rise of neo-fascists and new right in many cities. So we can also think about this type of approach as addressing another bit of the poly crisis that I mentioned earlier, which is to address the fear that drives hate. But I also don't want to end on a very, you know, too optimistic of a note, because we can't ignore the fact that we also have to be aware to struggle against the critics, the opponents, those who cannot see the value of a 15-minute city or bringing care into the city. I understand there's been protests in Brussels as well about 15-minute cities. There's been protests in Oxford last month, trying to sort of say, why on earth are we having this low traffic neighborhood or 15-minute city? What are what's taking away our rights? I don't begin to understand it. I would love to hear as a conversation piece what others would make of this, but we can't ignore it. We can't shy away from this reality as well. So questions for discussion then to wrap up, and these are just questions that I would like to throw out that maybe you can help me answer to start the conversation. So why are ecofeminist urbanists still promoting the same critiques and visions after 30 years? Why are we still having to say this? How do these visions intersect with those of other political movements? We don't own these ideas. They intersect and resonate, I'm sure, with many other movements. I've already mentioned the municipalist movement. What other hopeful examples can we consider? I would like to hear from you some hopeful examples. If the time has come, what needs to happen? Are city planners listening? Apparently in Montreal they're listening, but I don't know. It seems a bit early to tell if Montreal planners have become convinced by ecofeminist recommendations. Why are they listening? Why are they not listening? How to respond to the critics, the skeptics, the deniers, and the protesters from the Oxford and other places? Why is care so difficult to value and support when all life depends on it? And that's it. So I'm going to leave those up. I would love to hear your reflections, your comments, your experiences. Please introduce yourself. I'd like to hear what you're studying, where you're working, why this matters to you. Maybe I'll leave those up as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sherilyn, for your really inspiring, interesting talk. So please, we open the floor up to discussion. Yeah, please go ahead. Just be aware that the microphone is attached to a long wire, so we might have to do some movement.
Thank you. Thank you very much, first of all. It was a super interesting presentation. My name is Francesca, and I'm a student at the Urban Studies Master. And starting from your questions, but actually it was something that was in the back of my mind for the entire presentation, maybe talking about other hopeful examples that we can consider when we talk about ecofeminism, and especially about the co-sharing and co-living amongst women. I cannot not think about the Kurdish movement and about the 𝗁𝗏 and about like these women villages. And I was wondering how if you got inspired by this movement, and if you believe that it could be something that, like, if their way of seeing the future of like women and like within this society which is transforming and is changing in this direction because of environmental problems, if it is possible to translate their experience in the Western world and how. Yeah.
So did everyone hear the question? I mean, about 𝗺𝗲𝗃𝗴 and how ideas from municipalism and from 𝗵𝗶𝘃𝗶𝗃𝗀, social ecology, and from ecofeminism have all been sort of put into practice in this experiment in 𝗺𝗲𝗃𝗴. I haven't studied it, so I mean, I look at it and think, wow, this is incredible. I don't know whether it would work. I mean, it's certainly a big experiment of people trying to have an independent state and designing a new state with their own ideas and their own aspirations and sort of just commitments to become egalitarian. Has anyone here studied it or followed what's been going on? No? Have you? Would you like to say more about it?
But not specifically.
No.
Like I see very much the connection between these topics, and I've always been not super hopeful actually about how they could be translated in this Western, like in the Western world, because I don't even know how they are doing it there. If it's actually so. Just curiosity on how to translate the different.
It's a very interesting example, absolutely. Yeah, of taking sort of ideas from the West and sort of making them part of an experiment with the Kurdish people. Yeah. Thanks.
Hello, hi. Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm Melissa. I'm a journalist, but here I'm talking to you as a gardener. Because I am very involved in a community garden. And I've realized that in Brussels, there's a big tension between keeping wastelands that are then taken over by citizen groups to become community gardens or rewilding the land, and big real estate projects that are then promoted by politicians for welfare housing. And so I find myself in a personal conflict of what should we do then? And so I feel like this really fits into this because it's like care in both ways, right? I've heard also people saying that, oh, well, we have a lot of empty spaces in construction. Why don't we remodel those? But I'm not an expert on that. I don't know if you have any ideas or you've thought of that or anyone else has. Thank you.
Thanks so much. That was just fascinating. I learned so much from it, so thank you. And I wanted to, my name's Joanna. I've lived here for a long time. I'm a feminist activist involved in lots of different spaces of activism. And I didn't hear so much in your talk about power. And a lot of the work that we do around violence against women or around feminist economics and care is also about power. And I think power and how we rethink power as a non-patriarchal power, not the coercive power over, but the power within and the power with and the power to transform, answers quite a lot of these questions actually about why haven't, because it's obviously such a compelling case, why are we still stuck? And that's about who has power, who has the vested interests, who owns the land, who owns the decision making. And one thing that comes up a bit, and you mentioned it, I think, in your list, and we're seeing it blossoming all over, are these citizens' assemblies and participatory democratic models. But they also, I've found, do not adequately think about the feminist dimension, the intersectional feminist dimension. So it was just an opportunity to perhaps for you to elaborate more on the issues of power. Thank you.
No, I mean, I guess I just assumed it was so obvious I'd be talking about power that I didn't say the P word. Absolutely. No, I mean, the analysis of power is has always been part of an ecofeminist analysis. And I guess, I mean, this notion of trying to, feminize politics, which has sort of been promoted by the municipalist movement, for example, starting in Barcelona and various other places, about sort of deciding to bring sort of feminist values into decision making, and then to include more people, but also be a different way of working. So it's not just adding more women or other genders into the already existing way of working. So not just coming to the same table, but redesigning the table, right? So redesigning the processes, redesigning the way that decisions are made, the way that sort of what's valued, what's measured. But again, sort of the question is how do you reclaim power? How do you change power structures? And again, I would just say it has to be from both within and without. And so people who are working within these systems have to take on board certain values and ways of working that can change from within. And also the need, as I said earlier, the need for social movements and protest and people demanding from the outside. I mean, that's a pretty standard kind of answer to how social change has to happen. I'm not going to give you anything earth-shattering, and it's the answer to how we should think about it. But absolutely, power is at the heart of it. But I was wanting to focus on care tonight. Yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm 𝗺cie𝗃𝗶𝗴. I'm a researcher at the VUB, and I work for the regional administration as well as a planner. I would like to go back to I don't remember the title of your slide about the main principle of an ecofeminist city, and I would like and which looks almost like a paradise, like a utopia against like a dystopic vision of capitalism, fascism, and patriarchalism, and you name it. Yeah. But then I would like you to kind of reflect more, to elaborate on the cracks within this utopia, because I think we all agree about what's good and what's bad, but at the same time, this utopia almost sounds like post-political, and it's too easy that we all agree with that. And then what are, in that vision, the tensions that you see emerging, the conflicts, the kind of the trade-offs we need to cope with? And within this utopia, what are the problems? What are the things the good things we need to give up for an eco-feminist cities versus a sustainable city? Because this looks a lot like the sustainable city of 1992 or Agenda 21. I mean, it all looks very similar. So what are the cracks in this utopia? And especially what is unique in ecofeminism vis-a-vis all the similar utopias of, you know, the environmentally just city, the sustainable city, the smart city even, and so on. Voila, so what's I'm thinking?
Yeah, that's a difficult question to embark. I mean, I totally expected that question, to be honest. I mean, that's why I started with saying, like, we've been here before. I'm saying the same thing since the 90s, and I agree with you. It sounds the same and similar to many others. What is unique? I think I've tried to get across the point that what is unique is it brings together feminist concern with social reproduction and care, which is not shared equally in the green movements or radical planning movement or, you know, name some other movements. That is, I think, a feminist injection into those other movements is what is unique about feminism. What is unique about ecofeminism? It tries to say it's not just about caring and social reproduction in the human anthropocentric sense, but it's caring. It's how we integrate the concern about social reproduction with the concern of ecological flourishing. And so it tries to get away from an anthropocentric understanding of care. But there will be trade-offs. I mean, I'm sort of saying, you know, sort of a feminist city is a safe city for women, and that's very important. That's a kind of really, as I said, it's kind of, you know, inspired a lot of feminist urbanism since the 1960s and 70s. But when we think about, you know, parks that are safe for women, does that include cutting all the trees down so that we don't have, you know, hiding places? How do you think about an ecofeminist approach to making a safe park that, you know, that isn't, you know, doesn't, you know, that is like allows flourishing of humans and the natural world? So you know, what's a different way of designing a public space that promotes, I don't know, as I said, pollinators or gardening or those types of things. So I know it's not a very, you know, satisfactory answer. I probably need more time and a conversation with you to have a back and forth about it, because yeah, but I absolutely take your point. It sounds utopian, maybe post-political. I don't believe that it's post-political at all. I think that imaginaries and visions contribute to debate and to unsettle this notion that we just need technocratic solutions. We need to manage our way out of the crisis. This has nothing to do with managing our way out of the crisis. This is about adding new ideas into a debate, right? And unsettling the kind of comfortable ideas that we all agree that we just need, you know, we just need people to behave in certain ways to reduce climate change, or we just need people to recycle, we just need people to take their bikes. An ecofeminist perspective would ask a few questions, more questions about that, and insert questions about difference, diversity, intersectionality, and an intersectionality that's not just human difference, but human and more than human difference. So I don't know if that is getting somewhere towards your question, but if other people have ways that they'd like to improve on what I've said, that would be wonderful.
I'm 𝗁𝗲𝗃𝗃𝗃, professor of architectural theory at the University of Leuven. Thank you very much for this lecture. It was indeed a very nice bringing together of a lot of ideas that I was familiar with, but seeing it coming together like this really was great. Maybe one issue that you did not explicitly address, but that proves the difficulty of assuming that if we design the cities better, all things will be better, has to do with children and playgrounds in the city and sporting grounds and so on. Recently, there has been a lot of attention here in Brussels and in other cities in Belgium about girls in the city. And research is very clear that children are playing outside, girls and boys the same, until the age of 10, 11, and then it begins to change. So there is a lot of, well, I don't know, social pressure, peer pressure, or whatever, but girls tend to stay more at home than boys. 11, 12, 13 years, that's the moment the shift occurs. So I would ask your thoughts on that, because it's part of this whole thing. Eh? So it's not as if girls of 11, I don't know, all of a sudden, I don't know what happens to girl at age 11, but apparently they stop.
So you think it has more to do with the girls than the public spaces?
I think it has to do what the patterns that one sees apparently is, for example, if you have a huge sporting field, the boys are occupying it, and maybe the girls are sitting around. And so there are arguments about you can redesign public spaces, make sure that there are more different spaces, more differential uses possible, and then the girls will be happier to have more places to hang out. And so you have to make not one big thing, but several smaller things. Which might be a solution, but I don't think it's the solution. Right. It's also because somehow the socializing of girls and boys goes on in very, very traditional patterns. And so somehow girls seem to think that they do not belong on the middle of the football field, of the soccer field. They do not belong there. Somehow, when they're 11, they think that. That's for me very weird. Yeah.
It's weird.
It's very normal, but at the same time, it's weird.
You want to come in on that? I mean, so absolutely, it's not like build it and they will come. Like you can't just build some other kind of field and that the girls will come and play. But so obviously, there's cultural pressures, cultural forces we have to be aware of. This is, it's not. I don't sort of think that there's a kind of spatial determinism going on here. But I do remember reading something about 𝗰𝗶𝘃𝗴, a city in Sweden that has tried to recognize that girls don't use public green parks or green space the same way boys do. And they tried to address that by thinking about what facilities do they have in the parks, do a consultation with girls, do walking tours with the girls and say, you know, what is your impression of this space? Do you feel comfortable here? You know, what would make it more comfortable for you? I mean, this is, you know, from the safety audits of the 80s, of taking women around and say, do you feel safe here? Do you not feel safe here? What are the you know, the markers of a welcoming space for you? So research could, you know, should be done. I think it was done in 𝗰𝗃𝗴 to try to understand that, and that led to certain changes in parks, such as certain, you know, sports fields had like sort of girl only times and boy only times, or different types of sports that were being you know, promoted in the space, or areas for different type of socializing that can happen. So I suppose it would start with learning a bit more about what make girls tick, because I'm too old to know what make girls tick these days. So I think certainly urban planners and architects should sit down and speak to the users, number one. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, hello. Congratulations for the talk. My name is Lucia. I'm professor of history of theory of architecture in Spain. I'm from the University of Zaragoza. I'm here as visiting professor in 𝗁𝗂𝗵𝗃, and I would like to talk about the case of Barcelona, because I know the case very well.
Thank you.
I'm familiar.
Please do.
Yeah.
Did I get lots wrong?
No,
okay.
But I'm very familiar with 𝗁𝗃𝗃𝗃, the work of 𝗁𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗃, 𝗳𝗏𝗃𝗃𝗃, running the city council and so on.
Were you involved in it?
No, I not live there, but I'm very close to this area, so I'm not. So my reflection is about this question: are city planners listening? So the case of Barcelona, from my point of view, is very excellent, because feminist urban planners that were professors in the university moved to the city council to work in politics when they have the chance, when Ada Colau was in the city council. So these 4 years were very important to implement all these examples, because on the one hand, you have a very important feminist urban planning professor making the decisions, doing the decisions in the government of the city council, and on the other hand, 𝗳𝗏𝗃𝗃𝗃 was the professor doing that. She was doing a lot of competitions, urban planning, public competitions, giving opportunities to a lot of women, young women architects and urban planners, to be able to implement feminist policies and ecofeminist designs, like Blanca Valdivia, the collective Punzink, equal share, with the inclusive playgrounds in colleges and so on. So the idea is that not all urban planners are very engaged with this discourse, but once a political party is completely convinced that these ideas are good for the city, and they open possibilities for these urban planners to do that, the city changes a lot. So I think it's very important, this connection between politics and academia, to be able to make real changes in the city. But there is...
But there's a but.
But, obviously, there is a but. Yeah. But somehow another reflection I would like to say, because I was surprised that you put in the last slides the case of the 15-minute city of France, because from my point of view, the Carlos Moreno, the urban planner that is doing that in Paris, from my point of view, is a kind of usurpatory knowledge from women, because last semester I did an essay with a student, and we checked all the writings of this urban planner, Urban Moreno, and he, in all his writings, he never quote a women urban planner, any feminist. All the genealogy, all the knowledge that comes from urban planning is not. So somehow he's stolen the knowledge that comes from all these women planners. He only quote Jane Jacobs, the only one, because Jane Jacobs somehow is known everywhere. But since the 60s, a lot of things has been written, right?
So he coins the idea and gets all the credit.
So my point is, and also when Carlos Moreno is using these ideas, he's erasing all the terminology that can be joined with feminist thinking, ecofeminist, gender. So you cannot find any word related with feminism in his writings. So my question is, what happened? Why men, when they embrace these kind of ideas, and they use these ideas that come from women knowledge and feminist thinking, why they are somehow, on the one hand, they are very popular, right? Because probably everybody knows the 15 means city, but probably nobody knows the work of Blanca Valdivia, for example, right? So somehow it's like the terminology is dangerous. And one of the risks about this discourse is also the terminology we use. But on the one hand, if we want to keep women doing this, we need the terminology. But on the other hand, if we want to open the debate and everybody agree about this, we need to avoid the terminology. You understand what I mean? So there is a kind of also risk about how terminology should be used, because even 𝗳 now, with the super blogs in Barcelona, the way they are promoting and disseminating all these projects are without a feminist terminology, in order for the audience and the population to be happy about this. So what's going on with terminology? What do you think?
I mean, thank you. I really appreciate those comments, and I would love to talk to you more about it. I mean, when I heard about this 15-minute city, I was immediately thinking, like, I've heard about this before from studying urban planning as a master's student, and it had nothing to do with this guy. So maybe other people have thoughts about why it can be appropriated and presented as new, rather than being built on, being sort of in debt to other perspectives, particularly a feminist perspective. I mean, it's not unique to architecture or city planning, this kind of erasure of feminist thinking and feminist politics. I mean, it's another issue of, you know, the culture in which feminism is viewed, the backlash against feminism, the sort of it's quite easy to erase and to overlook, and that's, I guess, why we're 30 years later, we're still saying, what about gender? What about gender? What about gender? Because if feminists don't keep pushing at it, it gets forgotten. So, yeah, I don't have the answer. I wrote an article in my field is environmental politics. I didn't become a planner, by the way, so you probably gathered that I studied in the 90s. I didn't go on to become a planner. I came on to become an academic who isn't going into City Hall to try and change things from within. I'm standing on the outside, critiquing, imagining, and all of the rest of it. So agreed. Things don't change until we get positions of power in the inside. What was my point? Oh, the article that I wrote was a kind of, looking at 30 years of the journal Environmental Politics, which is the top journal in my field called Environmental Politics, and how in the 90s there was a kind of embrace of an ecofeminist political economy and showing that this is a radical new idea, it's really important, and through the next 30 years it kind of it became less and less engaged with, and in fact ridiculed as some sort of essentialist, goddess worship, spiritualist, something or other, that seemed to be really, people were really happy to promote that image of it in order to dismiss it. And I kind of trace the process through which that happened. I don't have an answer to why it happened. I really don't, but there must be a project there to find out from this particular architect / intellectual, and what does he read? What are his influences? Similarly, in my field, You know, why is it that a lot of mostly male environmental academics are really interested in new materialism because it's just so exciting, and they get to talk about, you know, flows and you know, interspecies whatever, and matters, you know, we've forgotten about matter, and they can only do that by erasing the fact that ecofeminists have always talked about the material and the importance of always thinking about ourselves as embodied, embedded material beings, and that the material is always relevant to politics and to life. You know, it could only be achieved by erasing that and then embracing the sort of new materialist ideas. Anyway, but that's another paper and another discussion, and other people might want to ask, or don't ask me anything more, just tell me things. I'd like to hear things. I'm sick of my own sound of my own voice by now. Tell me interesting things. Is there anything, like, can we kind of prioritize hope before we all go off on this Friday night? Is there some hopeful examples?
Hello there. My name is Annie.
Hi.
I'm from Brazil. I'm a researcher, and I'm doing a PhD. And at the beginning of my career, I studied co-housing at Germany. And 𝗁𝗂𝗵𝗃 is a resource very kind to me. And I start to try to understand how live together can change cities, can change the way we see cities, and can change we collaborate with everyone. Mm-hmm. So after that, I think that I get on a limit, and I get back to Brazil, and I start to research the resistance and the insurgents of women and the peripheries of Brazil. And curiosity, the ecofeminism, and the living together, it's tonight at the same place. During the pandemic, we have at the peripheries an action called Solidarity Kitchens, who feed up something like 2,005 people a day. And I think that when we think about ecofeminism, we have to think that as an international fight, and an international fight whose true and profound connect with South Global, because it's there that we've made the resistances more violent, and there's an approach with the state of power that is huge. And I wish that I want to hear you, that how do you think that we can resist together? Because there is no there and here. We are all together at the same climate crisis, who is going to burn all together. So that's that. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, the only answer I can give is just to suggest that you have a look at a kind of global ecofeminist movement that's being organized or sort of coordinated by the Women's Environment and Development Organization based in New York. It's a global organization, NGO, which has been working towards a global decolonial feminist Green New Deal. And it's a process that's been going on for the last probably 2 years. And they are doing networking with ecofeminist and feminist groups, women's groups from all over the planet. And each time they have their meetings, they're all online. Each time they have their meetings, they give the first speaking slots to women from the Global South and hear from women who are activists and resistors in the Global South, what they're doing, what they need, how can their projects and movements be supported. So there's an issue of how do we redistribute power, knowledge, etc., from north to south, and to definitely take on the responsibility of those of us privileged in the global north to demand cancellation of debt, demand reparation, demand, paying for the damage and the destruction that the global north countries have caused. So I would say that is like step number one. But also the work that's being done to build capacity, build knowledge to support resistance in different contexts is so important. So have a look at that work that's being done. I would say it's there's on their website you can find a couple of really excellent reports that set out the main kind of vision, but also concrete demands for a sort of a global decolonial feminist Green New Deal and how it would be financed. So the whole question of climate finance and financing these initiatives is taken up in that work.
Hello.
Hi.
I don't have so much a question, but more sharing.
Thank
as
you.
you asked. I'm Lisbeth de Donder. I'm professor at the Free University of Brussels, and I'm working mainly around social and environmental gerontology. And then, so I'm not an architect or a city planner or working on feminist studies, so I was mainly attracted by the care in the title. So I learned a lot, so thank you for that. And I wanted to share about in Belgium. The past years, we've been working a lot on caring neighborhoods, as we call it. So not really only about caring cities, but caring neighborhoods. And the past year, the Minister of Care and Well-being, actually he subsidized 132 caring neighborhoods across Flanders and Brussels. So you see a lot of happening and going on, and let's say the reason for starting was, like you explained, the care crisis. So the whole idea, care as we are organizing it now, it's not working, it's not enough. There are so many unmet care needs. But what we're seeing now in those caring neighborhoods actually is a lot what you showed on your last picture in Manchester, the green alleys. And for me, it's a little bit patchwork. You know, you take several tiles out and it's a little bit green. And actually, that's what they are doing now also in those caring neighborhoods. They're putting some benches, they're putting some green in the streets. And the whole idea is, if we bring people together, at one point they will start caring for each other. And that will be the solution for the care crisis. But at the same moment, all those structural, systemic faults in the care system are neglected, because the caring neighborhoods will be the solution for the care crisis. And of course, that's... And you bring in a whole discussion of the more... So I liked it very much, so thank you for that.
Yeah. That sounds similar to the critique of... In the UK, we've had Tories now, Conservative, for 13 years, and the first Tory Prime Minister was David Cameron, who brought in the big society, right? And we just need this big society of lots of little initiatives, people looking after each other, which is basically to stand in for the state and let the state off the hook. And I'm not advocating that at all, but that project that I showed with the pictures of the nice alleys, it happened during austerity, and it really was a people on their knees, absolutely could get nothing from the local state, could get nothing from the government, that they just had to take matters into their own hands. And I don't think that's something to be rolled out top down across any city, but it's a sort of example of what might come as an added benefit to putting care into the collective and public space. But yeah, thanks for that.
Yeah, this is still time for a question. Okay. Okay.
Is it an easy one?
It's more like a sharing, as you request that. No, I'm Francesc Badó. I'm also professor at the VUV since 2 years, but I'm from Barcelona.
All right.
And I've been I still collaborate a lot with the Barcelona Lab for Urban Environmental Justice, which you show one of the papers by Ita, Helen, and Isabel. Yeah, my comment or sharing, it was not about really Barcelona, because yeah, we have already talked about it, but yeah, it was a bit related to the grounds for children that you were mentioning. I'm involved in a project that is called Cool Schools, which is about the transformation of schoolyards into more climate adapted and greener, let's say, spaces. And this is something that is happening here in Brussels through the Operational Recreation project, in Barcelona through Climate Shelters project, in Paris through the Oasis. Well, there are many cities that are kind of transforming schoolyards into this kind of greener, and they also try to make them more climate adaptive. But in relation to gender, there's some evidence saying that when we move out from this kind of sport-centric or football-centric schoolyards and we transform them into more kind of natural spaces, there is also kind of, I mean, this is something that maybe we'll try to study in the project, but there's already some evidence that there is a change in the hierarchy about the use of the space between boys and girls, and there is a kind of diversification of games. I don't know for the teenager ages that you were mentioning, but for children, it seems that this is happening. So yeah, I mean, I just wanted to share this, that there is this kind of projects that at the moment are really, I mean, okay, schoolyards are not a big part of the urban space, but I have the feeling that they can be kind of transformative and going beyond the boundaries of the school. So yeah, just wanted to share that.
Thank you, that's great. Thanks.
Thank you so much, everybody, for your comments and questions. Yes. Unfortunately, I have to call it a day because we need to vacate the room. But I have the feeling that we could go on for several more hours. I think there's a lot of enthusiasm around the topic, and it's clear that there's an urge to discuss this. And I mean, maybe, yeah, creating a space for continuing these discussions, because it feels like it just wants to keep going. So thank you so much for, you know, lighting that flame.
Thank you for, thank you.